This week on The Sceptic.
I have just come from Buckingham Palace, where I have accepted His Majesty the King's invitation to form a government.
Director of PopCon, Mark Littlewood, joins me to ask whether Andy Burnham's days as Labour's golden boy are numbered and whether Count Binface is worth a punt in the upcoming Clacton by-election.
So he's not really an establishment figure, but he's quite helpful to the establishment because it's assisting them in attempting to ridicule Farage. The establishment will stop at nothing to try and prevent Farage from gaining further political power and entering number 10, and that's what they're doing.
Former school chaplain Bernard Randall tells the extraordinary story of how a sermon encouraging pupils to think for themselves about LGBT ideology led to him losing his job, being reported to Prevent, and spending years fighting to clear his name.
Effectively, I was being treated as a heretic against the new mainstream ideology, and so there were some desperately low times. And the fact that the church, which should have supported me to the hilt, was the organisation, the institution, which was actually attacking me hardest.
And for our premium subscribers, former MI6 chief Sir Richard Dearlove explains why Britain's energy policy has become a national security issue.
Chinese electric cars are basically Chinese computers on wheels. They can be reprogrammed by the manufacturer in China without us in the UK being aware. And you could have a situation where the Chinese government immobilised every city in the UK by switching off a number of Chinese electric vehicles.
Hello and welcome to episode 88 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Ellie Hodges. Now, this week saw Andy Burnham enter 10 Downing Street, but with Sir Keir Starmer joining the growing list of failed prime ministers and Labour seemingly developing a taste for dumping unpopular leaders, how long will Burnham's honeymoon last? And what does it tell us about the state of British politics? Well, joining me in the studio to discuss all that and more is Director of PopCon, Mark Littlewood. Welcome, Mark.
Always good to see you, Ellie.
So, I mean, what a week we've had. British politics, new Prime Minister coming in, Andy Burnham. And I would say that so far, with Andy Burnham's reputation, also the campaign in Makerfield, it's all been very much about the vibe, I would say. Do you think that we're actually going to be subject to quite radical left-wing policies, or do you think he'll continue this kind of vibe-based politics?
It's not mutually exclusive, is it?
Of course.
We could get both. I think, by and large, we're going to get continued drift.
Yeah.
And it's nearly... Andy Burnham's speeches and missives and statements are almost entirely impenetrable. There used to be a science called criminology, which was trying to decipher what senior communist officials had said in the Soviet Union, because you'd never get an absolute plain talking line from them, but you'd therefore have to sort of interpret whether this word or this adjective might mean that they tilt in that sort of direction or a different direction. And it's the same with Andy Burnham. It's all lots of hopey-changey stuff. Apparently all of our reflections are something to do with something that Margaret Thatcher did about 45 years ago. Why that hasn't been corrected since remains a mystery or has been lost to the mists of time. So I think that we're going to get a slight leftish drift and not much radicalism. That's my guess. Of course, the alternative theory is that he decides that he does have a radical plan and goes to the country. That's a possibility, but I don't think an especially likely one. So memes, vibes, happy clappy stuff, forever being reminded who his favourite pop bands are, lots of jogging in Everton shirts, and occasional policy announcements that don't really amount to a great hill of beans. That's what we're in for, I think.
And you've had a lot of kind of commentators, journalists talking about how we're going to get this Burnham bounce in the polls with him coming in. And what we actually have seen is the gap between the Conservatives, Reform and Labour actually tightening, and there not being as much as a difference as there was before with all of the Reform scandals. Do you think that we actually will see kind of more energy put now behind the Labour Party, because there is this idea of Andy Burnham coming in and there's hope within the Labour Party and things can be changed? But I mean, You did write in your article, which I thought was very interesting, that we saw with the Conservative Party, changing leaders doesn't actually amount to much.
Yeah, my view is that a change in leadership doesn't really amount to a great deal unless there is a change of plan. And consequently, I don't think that this change of leadership will really dramatically impact public opinion. There might be a short-term boost. There's a kind of wave of relief that Keir Starmer is no longer Prime Minister. Burnham is a much better communicator. Because so far he has said the square root of sod all, you can basically superimpose whatever your image is of a perfect Prime Minister onto him. So because there've been no hard tests yet. But usually for a change to make a difference, I think it needs to be about a very specific, dramatic policy area. So if you look through history, when the Conservatives binned Margaret Thatcher in 1990, it worked. I mean, you might ideologically regret the fact, but nevertheless it worked. There was a change of policy, certainly around our relationship with the European Union and the abandoning of the poll tax. And the Conservatives went on to win the next election. But she was removed largely for policy reasons. Mm-hmm. The same goes for Cameron, who removed himself, having lost the EU referendum, and Theresa May. Both were basically removed over European policy, and then a different European policy was executed. What's the big change this time? They just defenestrated Starmer because his opinion poll ratings were on the floor. His approval ratings were in the toilet. And they basically just said, well, we can't deal with these numbers. Let's have someone else. But very difficult to discern what part of Starmer's agenda Andy Burnham thinks was fundamentally wrong. So a mini bounce, a honeymoon lasting perhaps only weeks, possibly only days. And reality is going to hit Andy Burnham very fast, like a brick in the face. And if the underlying state of the economy doesn't change, if immigration isn't dealt with, if there isn't really a plan to get government spending under control, then it's going to be Groundhog Day. And I wouldn't be surprised if I'd give him more than 6 months, but in perhaps a year, the Labour Party are looking at the polls thinking, my God, his ratings are about as bad as Starmer's. Why don't we spin the wheel again? Because there has been no tangible, meaningful, clear-cut shift in policy. It's just a change in personnel.
And what do you think about, since Andy Burnham's kind of come back onto the scene, he talks a lot about his idea of Manchesterism and how he wants to put power to the north and, the number 10 of the north. Is that actually popular?
Absolutely ludicrous. I don't know whether it's popular or not, but absolutely ludicrous. Look, if he meant by that, which he clearly doesn't, but if he meant by that the government gets in the way too much, and we've got a whole swathe of areas in Britain where state spending accounts for way more than 50% of the local economy, sometimes as much as 70%. These are Soviet Union type numbers in terms of the size of the economy that's attributable to state spending. And we're going to roll it all back, and we're going to give you a lot more freedom. And, if you want to change your local licensing laws or allow more casinos or have a different approach to some area policy, you be you. But I don't think that he does mean that at all. I think he means shoveling even more money into regional aid grants. The number 10 of the North stuff is, absolutely mad. There is a reason why countries have capital cities, that they are the engine room of power, and I can not see anything that Andy Burnham or his chief lieutenants or a bunch of quangocrats and civil servants are more likely to achieve if they're sitting in number 10 in Wigan or Manchester than if they're sitting in number 10 in London. So it's utterly performative, ridiculous. It will die a fairly swift death.
And we've had him now appoint his cabinet, some very interesting people that he's brought back, one being Angela Rayner. And we have lots of people now coming up with the phrase, the Queens of the North, with some of the people that he's appointed. What do you think about his new cabinet?
It's a leftwards tilt, basically. It's difficult to precisely score each Labour politician about where they are on the kind of centre to left spectrum. But I'd say we've basically now seen the death of the Blairites. Liz Kendall, for example, is completely out of the cabinet. She would have been more on the right of the party. Yvette Cooper demoted. Ed Miliband, a lefty, Foreign Secretary, Louise Hay, Deputy Prime Minister, effectively, a lefty. It is John Healey, I guess, sort of middle of the road as Chancellor, but possibly slightly to the left of Rachel Reeves, who, for all of her faults, was doing something to try and stop runaway spending. We'll see whether John Healey is as robust in that regard. So not overwhelming, but a noticeable leftward tilt. I think with Louise Hay's unfortunate conviction for fraud 20 years ago, Jonathan Reynolds returning, who was the man who somehow thought he was a solicitor when he wasn't, and Angela Rayner, who was housing minister, didn't understand how taxes on housing worked. I think it's going to be a little harder for them to put a glove on their opponents if they get in trouble around finances or criminal convictions. So it's a tilt to the left. I don't think you can really say much more about it than that. The Starmerites have been completely eviscerated.
If there was ever such thing.
If there was ever such a thing. Well, it's not really an ideology. I just mean in terms of the personal loyalties of these people. So all of those who are very close to Keir Starmer have been kicked out. So he's probably already set up the beginnings of a gaggle on the back benches who will start to whinge if things don't turn around fast. I mean, look, there's no appetite for rebellion 24, 48, 72 or 96 hours into a new Prime Minister's reign. But I think there probably will be after 24, 48, 72 or 96 days.
And what direction do you think our economic policy is going to go? Because as you said, it's really hard to actually, when I've been asked this, I struggle to answer because we don't actually know much about what Andy Burnham's vision is, because he hasn't really been put under any real scrutiny to even say what his plan is.
Yes. Well, unsurprising, really. I didn't expect Gary Lineker to give him the third degree in his major sit-down interview. I think when it was evident he was going to emerge as the leader, he did a big press conference, was it up north in some warehouse somewhere, and didn't take questions.
Yeah, of course.
So again, we've just you've got to sort of read, you've got to plough your way through the word salad that comes out of his mouth and try and discern from that what it might mean for economic policy. And I think there are a few things you can detect. The first is, if he has any plans to cut spending in any area whatsoever, well, he hasn't even referenced them. He hasn't flagged it up.
Yeah.
He hasn't suggested it. He hasn't even had a nudge and a wink towards any area of government spending that's likely to fall. We can presume, I think, that defence spending will rise. It would be very strange if John Healey, who resigned over that matter as Defence Secretary, had not brokered a deal for the defence spending that he wanted to see in the budget. So that's one area of government spending I'm happy to see go up. But I don't think anything's going to be cut. I can't think of a single pound that's going to be saved. And if there is, they have stayed remarkably quiet about it. He seems keen on property taxes. I think that's another thing that we should say. I wrote about that for the Telegraph. I'm not, in principle, actually against rebalancing our tax system away from consumption taxes and away from work taxes and onto property taxes, particularly land taxes. If it was reducing one area of tax and shifting the burden to another, I would have a lot of sympathy with it. Actually, land taxes can be a very good way of raising money. But it just seems to be on top of all the other taxes. We now know that there isn't any plans to reduce income tax. So it's just another burden rather than a retilt of the tax system. It's probably about the only thing left that you can tax and bring in more revenue, because dialing up income tax or capital gains tax will just see more capital flight, less engagement in the labour market. So property taxes will come in. But if he wanted to do something dramatic about that, I mean, he just doesn't have a mandate for it. So if your plan really was to, I don't know, halve income tax receipts and to put it all onto land taxes, surely to God you need a general election in order to win on that platform. So I'm expecting that we will have continue to have very high public spending. I don't think there'll be any appetite to deregulate in any area meaningfully at all. Taxes will remain at an all-time high, probably complemented by yet higher taxes on property. Therefore, all things equal, unless we catch a lucky following wind from the rest of the world, maybe the war in Iran comes to an end, for example, sluggish growth. So basically, more of the same. with a smile, a bit of Manchester pop music and better eyelashes.
Do you think we will see more state intervention under Burnham's premiership? Because, I mean, we have had some good news that he isn't going to introduce digital ID, which I'm sure many people will be happy about.
Yes, that is good news. Actually, the initial thing was this, wasn't it? That they were going to abandon digital ID cards and spend the money that they had saved on reducing the tax on domestic fuel. Turns out they haven't saved any money because there wasn't anything in the budget for the ID card scheme. So the bit that, although I'm really pleased that digital ID has been scrapped. That is a real win for freedom lovers in British politics. But it shows a slightly amateurish and shambolic approach to things if they thought that was money they were really saving, where it was actually on the books as something that would have to be financed somehow or other. So the saving is illusory. More generally, I'm not expecting him to be especially liberal or especially authoritarian. He doesn't have any plan on immigration, from what I can see. I mean, I literally just don't think there's a policy.
I don't think he's even mentioned it.
I don't think he's mentioned it, so no change of policy, so that will continue to be a thorn in the side. Shabana Mahmood will, attempt a few things and will probably be thwarted by the lefty Labour backbenchers. So once all of the fizz and pizzazz has died down about the fact that we have yet another new Prime Minister, I think it's going to be remarkably similar to the past couple of years.
More of the same. Yeah. Moving on to the by-election that's coming up, the Clacton by-election has kind of not been in the headlines for the last few days. Obviously, Andy Burnham's coming in has kind of overshadowed it. But we have all of the other kind of mainstream parties, except for Reform, obviously pulling out. Now got a race between Nigel Farage and Count Binface. It's a bit unserious, isn't it? Yes, it is.
And it has echoes of the by-election that David Davis called back in the day, where he resigned on a matter of principle, probably to his constituents a slightly obscure matter of principle around habeas corpus. Probably to most Clacton constituents, this is a slightly obscure matter of principle as well. I don't doubt it is a matter of principle from Farage, but my guess would be if you asked the average Clacton voter, why has Nigel Farage called this by-election, they would probably be rather confused or inaccurate in their response. So it is unserious. There are 34 candidates, which I think is the most that have ever run in a by-election, possibly in a parliamentary election, and a whole swathe of independents. So look, the mainstream media have latched on to it's Farage against Count Binface from the planet Sigma 9.
Hi, Count Binface here, and I'm raring to go for the Clacton by-election. And my goodness me, there's no less than 34 candidates.
With his range of slightly wacky policies, some of which are very amusing. I do like his idea that the number of points you get for a try in rugby league should go up from 5 to 7 in line with inflation. But it's all a bit odd. However, peppered in, you might find, I don't know what their capacity is to put up a decent fight, that one of the independents is more serious than we think. The Social Democratic Party are putting forward their leader, William Clouston, who is a very serious man.
I'm William Clouston, leader of the Social Democratic Party, and I'm standing in the Clacton by-election.
If he can mount a decent campaign, you might well find it's Farage versus Clouston rather than Farage versus Binface. Haven't received any polling evidence yet, but with the main parties out of the way, it's not going to be especially meaningful. And there's every chance that if the Standards Committee stitch up Farage, that there'll be another by-election there in September or October.
Some people in the right-wing media space have claimed that Count Binface is actually part of the establishment. Do you think that's a bit too of a extravagant claim?
Well, yeah, it is a bit difficult to claim that a bloke who goes around with a spacesuit and a gigantic dustbin on his head is part of the establishment conspiracy. But actually, from what I can gather, John Harvey, is that the name of the comedian, I think, who plays Count Binface, is, a classics graduate from Oxford University who works in the comedy department for the BBC, which is no laughing matter, typically. And so he's not really an establishment figure, but he's quite helpful to the establishment because it's assisting them in attempting to ridicule Farage. What Farage has got to do is to make a very, very serious point about the by-election, that rather than it being him the victim, which he's in danger of playing, I think, it needs to be that he needs to really hit on the constitutional matter that the Standards Committee should not be the judge of whether people are fit to sit in Parliament. The electorate should be the judge of that. And I think it's appalling that we've accelerated the Standards Committee to such a level that your political opponents can disqualify you from sitting in Parliament for a sufficient amount of time that a recall election should be triggered.
Yeah.
I think we should go back to the old rules that you are eligible as an MP if you have been properly elected, as long as you have not been sent to prison for more than 6 months. And it's up to the electorate to get rid of you next time they have a chance, rather than, trying to engineer a complaint against Farage. It's worth saying, because of the political, the mathematical electoral power of the Labour Party in the House of Commons, Keir Starmer was not referred to the Standards Committee. Farage will only in the literal sense be judged by his peers, and it's a bunch of MPs. He will in effect be judged by his opponents.
Yeah.
And that is no fair way to organise elections. You can basically ensure that you put a relatively small party in parliamentary terms, very big party in terms of vote share in the polls. You can permanently stuff them up by looking at any misdemeanor or supposed misdemeanor and continually hold the sword of Damocles over their head. And that is not right, and that is not fair. And Farage needs to run, in my view, on that platform, rather than just the meme of they're all out to get me, the establishment have got it in for me, it's the people versus the establishment, which is a good meme and a good vibe. But I think it needs some substance behind it. And I'd like to hear from Reform and Farage about how they would change the standards regulation, the regulation of our own MPs, because I think it's completely out of whack at the moment. But at the moment, it's a Farage meme and vibe. I'm sure he'll win handsomely. But he really needs to win with a mandate that, although he wouldn't be able to carry it out, he can actually say, well, the people of Clacton have spoken on what they think of the standards system, because I've written this 5-point plan about how I'd change it, and I've just secured a higher share of the vote than Andy Burnham did in Makerfield, for example. Yeah. That's the only real point in this by-election. I suspect we'll get there, but as I say, Ellie, there's every chance, because the establishment will stop at nothing to try and prevent Farage from gaining further political power and entering number 10, that there'll be another by-election in October.
On that point, do you think that Farage and Reform more generally have been subject to an establishment hit job?
Oh, yeah. I mean, unambiguously so.
Okay.
Absolutely. I've got no doubt that Dominic Cummings is completely right on this point. Absolutely everything will be thrown at Farage and Reform. There will be more investigation into his private life, his family life, his financial affairs, than there will be for any other Member of Parliament. He needs to make sure he's got all of that absolutely sorted. Every box must be ticked. And it seems to me he hasn't quite done that, actually. I don't believe he's done anything wrong at all from the evidence I've seen in the public domain. But the nature of our politics now is, if you haven't ticked the right form and sent it to the right people in triplicate at the right time, you are presenting your establishment opponents with an open goal to completely stitch you up. So I think he should have done things rather differently around the £5 million gift that he received from Harborne. He hasn't done anything wrong, but he needs to know that his every move, unless it can be defended unambiguously, as clear as the driven snow, and is wholly explicable, is going to, I'm afraid, give opportunities to all of his political opponents to gum him up and stitch him up, and that's what they're doing.
And you have some of the left-wing media. Something that springs to mind is the News Agents podcast with Emily Maitlis, Lewis Goddard, saying that Farage is actually part of the establishment and he is everything that the establishment embodies. I'm guessing that you would disagree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem here is, so let's do the semantics and get our terms right. Yeah. Okay, so, Farage likes fine wine, dining in swish London restaurants, smoking a big fat cigar, and all of the rest of it. He's wealthy, self-made. He went to private school, a pretty decent private school, all of those you would say, well, there's a person who's part of the establishment. You know, he wasn't brought up on a housing estate, and you know he goes for all the establishment things. But that, in my view, is a misuse of the term.
Agreed.
What I mean by the establishment and the anti-establishment is your political agenda essentially to preserve the status quo or disrupt the status quo? And it doesn't matter how many times Farage dines at Boysdale's and smokes a cigar and enjoys claret whilst wearing a tweed jacket. That's not what's relevant to whether your establishment is whether your platform is to overhaul the system or to sustain the system. And Farage is unambiguously in the overhaul the system camp. So a vast number of vested interests are under extreme threat if Farage actually makes it into power. So he is unambiguously an anti-establishment politician, irrespective of the fact that he likes cricket, he likes fine wines, and he likes wearing tweed jackets when he's out in the country. That is completely irrelevant. It's what is your political agenda, and he is a radical and a disruptor. And Emily Maitlis, John Sopel, Lewis Goodall and the newsagents are not. They are pro the status quo, essentially. So that's my definition of it. It's not where you eat or what you wear or how expensive the wines are that you drink. It is where do you stand on the present political settlement? Are you in favour of it, or are you in favour of a transformation of it? And Farage is a disruptor, a radical, and therefore an anti-establishment figure.
And what do you think about the state of the Conservative Party at the moment? We have Kemi Badenoch's personal popularity is actually quite high, but the party's still isn't. However, they are climbing up the polls, albeit quite slowly. Do you think they could have a comeback?
Well, I think they are having something of a comeback from, a year ago, it being speculated that there might even be a coup against Kemi Badenoch. That has clearly utterly evaporated. So her security as the leader of the party is absolutely unquestioned. So that means that she has the power, the right and the ability to now mould the party wholly in her own image, right, rather than having to second guess anything about whether it might alienate, cheese off or irritate a particular faction of her party. And I think you're right to say, Ellie, I don't study every opinion poll to the last decimal point, but the Tories have probably ticked up from the kind of mid to highest teens to the very high teens or early 20s, which is some sort of revival. What's interesting to me is, well, if reform collapses for some reason, I think the Conservative Party are in a position to benefit from that. If the whole thing blows up or Farage throws in the towel and decides he wants to move to America, if there's infighting or whatever, if reform implodes, which I don't think is very likely, but I think is possible, then you could basically see Kemi's Conservatives reaping the benefit of that. But what I think she has established, at least for the time being, unless reform can move into another gear, because they've been coasting really for the last year or so, and have walked into some bear traps that they've basically laid for themselves, that Kemi seems to have prevented the death spiral of the Conservative Party, right? So I think there was one scenario where after the catastrophic defeat for the Tories in 2024, and then with Kemi having, let's be honest, a somewhat slow start as the leader of the party, that you could imagine a situation in which the Conservatives just spiralled into sort of nothing. And there was a sort of legacy 5-10% of the electorate who voted for him out of habit, but the general trajectory was downwards towards zero. She seems to have at least stemmed that bleeding. And if you've got a Conservative Party, which by historical standards is a very poor share of the vote, but holding 20% or so of the vote, it's difficult to see how you can pilot your way to a right-of-centre government without the Conservatives being at least some part of that, and in Kemi's mind, the leading part of it, possibly the only part of it if she gets lucky. So it seems to me that the death of the Conservative Party is now very unlikely in the next few years, and that was on the card a year ago. But that's a long way away from saying that they're on a trajectory to win the next election outright, or even to hold the number of seats they've presently got, but one step at a time. I think what she needs to do now is which she's got the personnel to do, and Nigel doesn't, is more of her team need to come to the fore. And she probably needs to shake up the shadow cabinet. initially she offered a position to all of her defeated leadership rivals as a kind of unity presentation. I think she's got to decide who are the best 3, 4 or 5 people I've actually got. Make sure they've got the top positions, make sure they are on television morning, noon and night, and to project that we are a serious team. I mean, some of them are there. I think Chris Philp's done a good job as the Shadow Home Secretary and is pretty high profile. But I think there are probably other slots right at the top of that list where you need fresh people in there. Why Katie Lamb isn't one of the top 3 or 4 people now, that needs to happen soon, in my view. Jack Rankin, likewise. And there needs to be 2 or 3 others as well. Claire Coutinho's done a reasonable job, but I think she needs to think in terms of her shadow cabinet, having a subset of maybe half a dozen people who become household names. And she's made herself a household name, and she's doing pretty well in the approval ratings. I think she's about net zero, actually, which is good for a politician. About as many people like her as dislike her. But she needs 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 others in the Conservative ranks to become famous and relatively popular. That would be my advice to her about her challenge for the next year.
Lastly, Mark, you are a betting man. Who are you putting your money on for the next general election?
Who do I think will win? I think it will likely be, I think the best guess at this stage is it will be a hung parliament with Reform as the largest party. So I think somehow or other we will get to a situation in which the right of centre do win 326 or more seats. I think that is likely. At the moment, if you were just to map the polls onto every seat in the general election, it's a right mess. I think any discussion of whether there are pacts or non-aggression arrangements is probably premature. But I think the electorate are sharp. The electorate might determine for themselves which is the best right of centre candidate in each seat. So you might then see a Conservative revival, probably largely consisting of taking seats off the Liberal Democrats in the south, but making virtually no headway in the Red Wall, which for a fleeting moment was theirs, and Reform making huge progress in the Red Wall and probably in the east of England. That's the spot price at the moment. But I think Reform need to go through their next stage of growing up. They've done an amazing job to have got whatever it was, 14% at the last election and to win some seats. They then did a fantastic job of doubling their vote share in the polls, winning nationwide elections when we've been going to the vote in the locals, doing very well in council by-elections. But it needs something else, I think, in order for them to get back to 30% of the vote or above. And that something else is an absolutely credible, serious policy platform. And at the moment, they've been very good at announcements that have been eye-catching. Sometimes, in my view, they have then unravelled because the serious policy work hasn't gone in. But they need a serious range of policies, properly researched, properly reviewed, properly red-teamed and road-tested before they're allowed out into the wild. And then you might just see that the Reform momentum picks up again. So I don't write them off as winning the election outright, but they have been found a little bit wanting on this challenge of proving to the electorate that they're genuinely ready for government. That's the challenge for them.
Mark, thank you very much for joining me.
Ellie, always a pleasure.
Now, imagine losing your job, being reported to Prevent, and spending years fighting your own church, all for delivering a sermon encouraging students to think critically about gender and identity politics. Well, to discuss his extraordinary story, I'm joined by former school chaplain Bernard Randall. Welcome, Bernard.
Welcome. Hello, thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you for joining me. Now, take us back to that day in 2019. What actually happened with the school's diversity training, and why did you decide to give that sermon in chapel?
Yeah, well, the diversity training, such as it was 2018, and the sermon was 2019. So there was a sort of long run-up to the sermon itself. The training was led by a woman called Ellie Barnes, who was the CEO of Educate and Celebrate, which is one of these very much aggressively pro-LGBT QIA, whatever the initialization is these days, group. And their aim is to smash heteronormativity, to embed gender identity and sexual orientation in the life of the school. which is a bit weird, really. I mean, smashing heteronormativity. So it was a very well presented training session in many ways. She knew what she was doing, gradually working from what you might say is sort of very basic. Well, it's good to have examples in our maths of not just if Peter gives Jane 2 apples and he had 5, how many does he have left? But if Abdul gives 3 apples to Rashid, how many does he have left? Sort of thing. Yeah. Things that you wouldn't necessarily think were a problem. But it working up to introducing the gender stuff and, for example, telling us that gender identity is a protected characteristic in law, which it isn't and never has been. But so the sort of the false information there. And at one point having the staff chant along the lines of, what do we want to do? And the response for the staff was supposed to be, smash heteronormativity. And quite a lot of staff joined in with that chant, smash heteronormativity. I didn't, because I had a fair idea of what it means. I suspect a lot of staff didn't. So there was a process between that and the sermon where I said to the school leadership, this is really not suitable for a Christian school, for Church of England Foundation school. We need to discuss some of what's going on here. They refused to engage with that. And then eventually in the summer term in 2019, people asked me to address in chapel the question, how come we're told we have to accept all this LGBT stuff in a Christian school? Which is a really good question because it's about compelled speech and compelled belief rather than which side is right or wrong morally. And so I decided it was really important to tackle that. Clearly, pupils were being told they had to adopt a particular ideological viewpoint. That is inappropriate in any circumstances, in any school, on any ideology. It doesn't matter that it was LGBT stuff. So I said, basically, you don't have to accept someone else's ideology or beliefs. You make up your own mind. You think it through. You may, if you wish, accept the church's teaching on marriage. You may believe sex is real, gender identity isn't necessarily coherent. But whatever you do, respect those who disagree with you. Loving your neighbour as yourself doesn't mean you have to agree. It does mean you respect the sincerity of their beliefs. And no excuse for personal attacks or abuse, which I thought was pretty moderate and just the kind of thing that our young people need to hear in a world where there are polarised views. Turns out that the school leadership did not think that the pupils needed to hear that moderating view.
And when you found out they'd reported you to the Prevent Terrorism programme, what was going through your head? How shocking was it to be treated like you were some kind of threat?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty scary. I mean, I had been suspended from work and I was being accused of misconduct for saying in a Christian act of worship that you may adopt Christian beliefs if you wish to, which from my point of view is in no way misconduct. That's exactly what I was there for. So that the absurdity of the whole thing was already quite high. And then I discovered in some of the papers leading towards the disciplinary hearing that they were going to have that they'd reported me to Prevent, which just conjured up in my mind images of police officers breaking down the door in a dawn raid and seizing all the computers and devices in the house. And life being utterly turned upside down. Fortunately, that didn't go very far. It turned out that the police officer who received the report said this doesn't meet the threshold for terrorism, which should have come as no surprise to anybody. And why on earth did they report me in the first place? It's just utterly bizarre. I think people being captured by the ideology, which says, things that we're familiar with, silence is violence and all those kind of ideas, that merely speaking certain words is a threat to people's existence. So it's that kind of ideology that motivated the person who reported me, as far as I can make out. But the police officer said that the sermon was inappropriate in a school and inappropriate for society, which is extraordinary. So to express in moderate terms the Church of England's teaching, the established church, and say that's inappropriate in society, a marker of how far from reality the police have become. I mean, this was 2019, so perhaps they're a bit better now. I hope they are. But it was a difficult time.
So 7 years is a long time to have your life and ministry on hold. How did this whole ordeal affect you personally, your family, and your sense of calling?
It's been really difficult because I wasn't able to do the job that I really loved doing. So I lost my job with the school, and that was difficult enough. Granted, it was Church of England school, the leadership was largely secular. So to the extent that they didn't know better, it was difficult, it was upsetting, but it was sort of understandable. For the church authorities, so the church authorities launched a safeguarding procedure against me on the grounds that somehow teaching the church's teaching could be harmful, could conceivably be harmful, or I don't quite know exactly what they were thinking. Again, I think the ideology had crept into the church's safeguarding people. So that I was treated as a threat. So having been accused of being a potential terrorist, now I was being accused of potentially being a child abuser, which, those are the two worst crimes you can be accused of in our world. And so there were some desperately low times through the whole thing. And the fact that the church, which should have supported me to the hilt, was the organisation, the institution, which was actually attacking me hardest, was really tough. So significant financial losses. Personal, my health has suffered. My family have suffered the experience of me suffering, and the impact it's had on them has been significant. So there's a massive human cost there. And in terms of calling, vocation to ministry, it's still there and it's still strong. And I want to get back to ministry, but it certainly made me doubt the Church of England and to look at what the Church of England is and compare that to what the Church of England should be, and thinking, can I contribute to the Church of England being better than it is? Because I desperately want the Church of England to be a beacon of light in our nation. And all the, quite apart from the religious content, I think as an institution that can give a sense of coherence and unity to our nation, desperately needed if only the church would step up. Plus, I'd like people to become disciples of Jesus as well, So I do still have that sense of calling to the Church of England, and I want to make a positive difference within the church, but it has been very hard. I've been sort of stripped back to first principles, and I'm having to rebuild my life from there, which has been very difficult.
And you were basically just explaining traditional Church of England teaching on marriage and encouraging kids to think and debate. Why do you think that caused such a massive backlash?
Well, as I say, I think that the capture of institutions by progressivism, wokeism, cultural Marxism, whatever label one wants to give to that sort of way of thinking, has been quite extensive. And the thing that the sort of the Marxist undercurrent doesn't really like at all is any sort of disagreement. So the idea of false consciousness, that the working class haven't risen up in revolution because they have this false notion that actually their lives are perfectly decent already as it happens. And the point of the revolution is to persuade the working class that they need to rise up, that their lives could be so much better. And that's all been transferred to other groups. So in this particular case, it's the LGBTQIA+, and it's the TQIA+, that's the particularly pernicious part in terms of the ideology. So effectively, I was being treated as a heretic against the new mainstream ideology that came in the last few years. Hopefully it's better now, because I think for women in Scotland in the Supreme Court ruling and some other areas, life is getting better. I don't know that I'd have the same reaction if I gave the same sermon now as I did. That said, I'm not confident that I wouldn't. I think the church could still potentially find it very challenging to have a minister preaching as I did, and that worries me that they haven't apologised for what they've put me through, despite the fact that they could find no genuine safeguarding concern, and it's taken them so very long that the local authority designated officer for safeguarding, so the secular authority, closed the case within 1 day after it was reported to him. He said, this is not safeguarding. Why did the church take the best part of 7 years? I can only put it down to that institutional capture, which shows that no institution is immune to this kind of force. And so the fight has to carry on, and sensible, rational thinking people need to keep objecting to being told what they have to believe.
And do you think that when all this happened to you, we were at the peak of wokeism and progressive politics? And as you said, if you gave that same sermon now, do you think you would still get the same reaction?
I think we were probably at a sort of peak period. So it was 2019, 2020 was peak. And in terms of transgender ideas, ideology, we also had George Floyd and race, and subsequently in 2020. So that period was particularly difficult in terms of the progressivism seeming to take over everything. Is it better now? Yes, in many ways, but I don't think there's any room to be complacent, because so many institutions are full of people who still believe this kind of stuff. And of course, institutions bring with them a sort of inertia, a sort of just momentum that you don't stop. It's like stopping a train. It takes, or a super tanker at sea, it takes a long time for it to slow down and then stop, and then to reverse course. So there's no room to be complacent, because it could very well be that these things just bubble back up to the surface and we're back worse than where we started, depending on political developments. We'll wait to see how Andy Burnham deals with any of this sort of stuff, for example.
Now that you've finally been cleared and can preach and work in education again, what's next for you? And what would you say to other chaplains who might find themselves in a similar situation today?
It's very difficult to know what's next for me. This is the big question. I've been cleared. I'm allowed to return to ministry. I could apply for jobs in schools, though whether that's something I want to do, I'm not getting any younger, and to restart in education, I think, might just be a step too far. The Diocese of Derby are not giving me any support in terms of getting back to ministry. They basically said, well, you know where to look for jobs. Here's the advert pages. Sort yourself out, which is really disappointing after all they've put me through. So I'll wait and see. It's where the Spirit leads kind of thing, really, exactly what that looks like. And it may be in a couple of months I'm in a new post. It may take a couple of years. I don't know. In terms of other people dealing with this sort of idea and what you might do or say, I think that the important thing is that you have to have integrity. You have to be able to look yourself in the mirror and say, I did the right thing. I stood up at the right time. When it needed saying, I said the thing that needed saying. And that will be different for everybody. And there is a case for saying, don't put your job at risk, and stay within the organisation so that you can be a gentle voice in the background rather than sticking your head over the parapet. And sometimes that's right and that works. But sometimes there just is a point where you have to say, I cannot cross this line. I cannot go beyond this. I have to object. I have to say what I believe to be true. And that applies in all walks of life. And I think, speaking from the point of view of Christianity, we believe in a particular truth, and we believe in the importance of speaking that truth. But I think that we're all created as truth-telling beings, if you like, that for all of us, being truthful, being honest, is deep in the heart of what we are as human beings. And there comes a point where you harm your own soul, integrity, psychological well-being, whatever you want to call it, if you lie and go along with a thing that you know isn't really true. So my advice would be, make sure you can look in the mirror each morning, because although, there's this chap 2,000 years ago who said, what does it profit a man if he gain the world and lose his soul? And I think that applies. Keep your soul, keep your integrity intact, even if it means hardship that's financial or in other kinds.
Well, whatever path you choose, we wish you all the best. Bernard Randall, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure.
Now, Britain's energy policy is usually talked about as a climate issue, but what if it's really a national security issue? Well, joining me now to discuss why he believes the UK's current approach is leaving us more vulnerable is former MI6 chief and host of the One Decision podcast, Sir Richard Dearlove. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Hello, Ellie. I'm very pleased to be on your podcast.
Thank you for joining me. Now, you have argued recently that net zero has become a national security issue rather than simply an environmental or economic one. Why do you believe successive governments have failed to recognise that link?
Well, I think you have to go back a bit and look at the whole issue of national security and defence and recognise the extent to which this has been a sort of neglected area of government funding over a long period of time, particularly the debate about our national defence budget and our expenditure on defence. But if you look at this as a completely integrated problem, what is of fundamental importance to the UK's economy is how we produce our energy, how much we pay for it, and the extent to which we have dependencies which we don't control. So I think that, what I would say is that if you look at the overall picture, you can't separate these issues. And energy is of such importance both to the budget of each one of us, but also it's fundamental to how the economy functions. So you can't sort of put it aside when you're looking at a situation globally where I think there's acknowledgement now that we face significant national security problems internationally, particularly from Russia.
And you compare Britain's net zero policies to the command economies of the Soviet era. Some would say that's an exaggerated comparison. What similarities do you think people are missing?
Well, I agree that it's an extreme example, but I made it, as it were, to make people sit up and think. And the reason I made it is because if you look at climate change as much as an ideology as it is as a fact, you have a set of what I would describe as, well, I'm going to be controversial and say let's say a fashionable obsession, which is many people are sort of obsessed about. And if you look at it, in my opinion, from a purely scientific point of view, we're using that sort of ideological driver to make us consider all issues related to energy, and particularly the issue of climate change. Now, I'm not a climate change denier, but I think what I would say is...
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.